Hello and welcome to Tonight at 8 from the RSGB. Taking amateur radio on holiday can be a great opportunity to try new things from new places. But how do you go about operating portable? Which antenna are practical but effective? And how could you do this abroad? Someone who's done all of this is Daimon Tilley, G4USI, and he's here tonight to share his experiences and give us some tips. Welcome to Tonight at 8, Daimon. Can you give us a quick overview of what you'll be covering this evening?
Yeah, well, hi David and hi everyone. Well, I'm just going to talk about how I got into taking HF abroad, because when I got back into the hobby about 5 years or so ago, I got so re-hooked after a 30-year absence, I didn't want to leave it behind when I went on holiday. So I'm hoping to cover all of the considerations you need to take when you're either going abroad or elsewhere in the UK to operate HF from wherever you might go.
Excellent. It sounds brilliant. We look forward to that. And before your presentation, though, a reminder to everyone at home now that if you're watching this on Monday the 3rd of October, then this is live. And you can ask questions or make comments on either BATC or YouTube chat at any time during the presentation or straight afterwards. Please include your first name and call sign, if you have one, within every message. And note that you can make this video stream fill your screen on most devices, usually by double-clicking on the picture or pressing the full screen button. But now, back to Daimon to find out how you can take your hobby on holiday.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm hoping to inspire you, if you've not already done it, or at least give you some tips about things you might want to consider about taking HF on holiday, should you decide that that's something you want to do. And this first picture you've got here on the screen is a picture of me operating from the Italian lakes with my little Zygu rig. And a very long wire that's strung up just 12 or 15 feet in the trees. And I had some wonderful fun. I just dipped in and out here and there and really enjoyed it. And that's probably the first time I really took HF abroad with me in a serious sort of way. And I can't stop myself now, I'm afraid. It's something every holiday I go on, it's something I want to do and take with me. And I have a lot of fun in planning how I'm going to go and do that. And I hope to share with you tonight some broad ideas about the things that you might want to consider if you want to take HF on holiday, and to think about what you might have to do if you want to operate abroad, what power or mode you want to use when you go on holiday, think about some antenna choices, how you're going to power your equipment, and then share with you some of my travel kits. I've got half a dozen different travel kits I've put them together over the last few years. And then finally, we're going to think about how we might operate on HF abroad without a radio. How might you do that remotely? So we'll just touch on that too. So let's get into it. Well, why you want to do it? What is the motivation? Well, it allows you to think about working from a different region or a country that you've not worked from before, and opening up paths for perhaps new DX or to work countries you've not worked before. You might love the hobby and can't bear to be without it. And certainly when I got back into the hobby after a really long hiatus, I really became hooked in a big way again, sort of in the early 80s. And didn't fancy it a week or 2 weeks away from the radio, quite honestly, even though it was going to be an adjunct to the family day. And all through this presentation, I'm going to talk about operating in a way that suits me, and that is as an aside to a family holiday. It's not what the main objective of the holiday is. It's not about a DXPedition. It's probably about operating in the same way that you might pick up a book one evening when you're on holiday to relax. It's about filling in for half an hour or an hour and just having a bit of fun. Sometimes, depending on where you're going, you might even become the DX yourself if you're in an area where, there aren't a lot of amateurs or many activations. So let's start by just talking about some of the broad considerations that you might make when you're planning a trip away, and it could be in this country or elsewhere. And clearly you need to think about who you're going with. I go with my wife and 2 teenage boys, and there's no way that I would want to, even if they'd allow me to, spend hours and hours each day operating on the radio. So it very much is for me just like taking a Kindle or a good book. It's something I can put up and put down. I might set up at the start of the holiday if I'm in one place and conditions allow, and just leave it there and then just turn the radio off and on whenever suits me, really. So you need to think about what sort of time of the day you're going to be operating as well, because that will inform your band choice, for example. If you're going to travel light and you don't take a lot of equipment, you might not take a 10-band radio. If you're going to operate mainly during the evening hours, you might want to take something for the lower bands, 80, 40, 30 maybe. And if you can operate predominantly during the daytime, you may look at some of the higher bands. And you clearly need to think about what space you've got for antennas. You know, are you staying in an apartment where you've just got a balcony? Are you staying somewhere like I did in that very nice villa on the Italian lakes? Are you in your caravan? Just thinking about the sort of space you've got for your antennas, and also the other kit that you take with you is quite important. Equally, some of your choices will be driven by the precise location you're operating from. You know, if you're going to be operating in the middle of a city centre, then maybe SSB or CW may not be the preferred choice. You might choose one of the digital modes to accommodate some of the higher noise floor you might expect. You're clearly going to want to travel really reasonably light. You know, I'm not going to be lugging around with me a big 100-watt HF rig and a big PSU and all sorts of adapters when I go on holiday. That's not my cup of tea, but it might suit some. And then you've got to think about your license. So particularly if you're thinking about operating abroad, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail, the sorts of permissions you might need, and also how you might choose how much power you want to transmit with, and also how you're going to get the power to power your gear to transmit at that level of power output, RF output. So let's start, first of all, with having a quick look at operating abroad. And for me, I think the Italian trip was maybe my first time abroad with HF. And so I had to, first of all, start scratching my head and thinking back to licensing conditions and think about, well, okay, what does the license allow me to do? And as a full licensee, that allows me to operate in most EU countries under something called the CEPT arrangements. I'm not even going to attempt to remember what that stands for, but it's an international agreement, particularly amongst EU-led countries, that allows you to operate with similar license conditions abroad. And thankfully, Brexit hasn't scuppered that, so those regulations still apply. And that normally allows only full UK license holders to operate abroad. But you do need to check before you travel with the website, the governing body of the country you're going to, because actually some countries do seem to allow other classes of UK license to operate. I've got no direct experience of this, but I certainly see from my research that it looks like Australia, for example, might allow foundation or intermediate UK licensees to operate in Australia with their equivalent licenses conditions. No experience of it, so please check that out before you travel. But that looks like that might be possible in some places. Bottom line is that if you've got a full license, you can operate in most places around the world. And just in a few cases, with foundation and intermediate licenses, you can operate in a few countries as well. But you really do need to check before you travel. And actually, that's quite a challenge sometimes, because whilst a lot of the countries will provide information from their licensing body or from their RSGB equivalent in English, many of them don't. So judicious use of Google Translate, for example, can often be required to try and work out what it is you can and can't do. And then, if you are going to operate abroad, it's really good advice to take your license with you. I've operated abroad a lot now, but I've never been asked by any official what I'm doing or to have a look at my license, but it would seem to be sensible to take it with you, and possibly even consider a translation for the language of the country you're going to if English isn't very widely spoken. There's a lot of chat on a number of social media sites about, I'm traveling with my radio, will I have a problem? Will I have an issue with airline security? Will I have an issue with the airline itself? I've never had a problem, I have to say, and only once in May this year when traveling to Denmark, was my equipment that I took through on hand luggage with me. Was that examined in some detail after it had gone through X-ray? And when I say in some detail, actually what it did, they opened it, asked me what it was, and quickly passed an explosive swab over the top of it. Checked that, and of course that was negative, and off I went with a smile. So I don't think it's certainly my experience thus far, not been a very big issue, but I know a number of people can get concerned about it. The issue where you may come unstuck more than any other, perhaps, with your radio, is with battery power. And most airlines will allow batteries in the cabin, but they usually prescribe something of less than 100 watt hours. So 12 volt, 8 hour ampere battery would be coming in at 96 watt hours. But you need to check with the airline because they do vary. 100 watt hours seems to be a bit of a de facto standard, but actually I know that some airlines in the US will allow more than that, for example, if they're split between more than one battery. So that's definitely worth checking out before you go. It can't be much worse than getting ready to travel abroad on holiday, all excited about operating abroad, only to find that a significant portion of your equipment is confiscated. When you go abroad, you obviously need to identify, and you'd normally identify with your normal call sign, and add a prefix. Prefix is usually the country code followed by a slash. So I was on a cycling holiday in Sweden, the west coast of Sweden, in May this year, traveling through the area that's circled in red there, and I prefixed my call sign as Sierra Mike / Golf 4 Uniform Sierra India. Now, the map there on the right, interestingly, a lot of countries like Sweden and the States, for example, will have some regional identifiers as well, where they might use a different letter or a different number to identify which part of SM you are in or from. And when I looked at the Swedish website, it was clear that it was an option. So I could have added a 6 or a 7, respectively, depending on where I was on my bike ride, to the SM call sign as I moved through the country. I chose not to do so, just to keep things simple. And frankly, I'm not sure I'd have been entirely clear when I was in 6 and when I was in 7 at some point. So I just wanted to keep things simple. So then you need to think about what sort of power and mode you want to operate. I mean, unless you're on a DXPedition, you're not going to be lugging a great big HF linear amplifier with you. But are you going to use voice? Are you going to use CW? Are you going to use a digital mode of some sort? Is clearly a fairly key consideration. For me, I'm mostly a CW man. And so consequently, that's a fairly easy choice for me to make. I have operated abroad on SSB and FT8 too. And actually, sometimes it's helpful just to keep your options open, because you never really know what you encounter till you get to where you're going. If you're thinking that you're going to operate SSB and then you suddenly get somewhere and you find you're in a very noisy city or town where there's S9 background noise, then FT8 may well have been a better choice, and it's a shame if you're not prepared for that when you get. And then what about antennas? We're not going to be counting a big antenna file with us. What might we do there? There are hundreds of choices of antennas, aren't there? There's more choice of antenna than there probably is of radio to take with you. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I've tried each and every one of them, or that you should make a particular choice yourself. But I am just going to share with you a few thoughts that hopefully might inform you, and just share with you my 2 favourite portable go-to antennas. And of course, your antenna choice is going to be largely dependent on where you go, how much you can carry with you, how you're getting about. When I was cycling 400 kilometres up the Swedish coast, I wasn't going to be taking anything big and bulky of any description, let alone of an antenna. And it is about being on holiday and not being a DXPedition. You want to travel fairly light and have plenty of room for packing your clothes, your sunscreen, and everything else you might want to take with you. So largely for me, it's some form of compact wire antenna with a counterpoise, maybe or maybe not some coax. That depends on what I'm taking. And then you've got to think about whether or not you're going to take a resonant antenna or an antenna tuning unit and a non-resonant antenna. Sometimes I do a bit of both, and we'll just delve into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Sometimes that depends on the radio you might choose to take with you. And then you might need some sort of support to put your antenna up. You might be as simple as throwing a wire over a tree, or you might want to think about, depending on the nature of the countryside you're going to, whether or not you need some form of very small and compact support pole, a fishing pole type of thing. But when it comes to operating portable, either at home, on holiday, or abroad, then I tend to just be very, very comfortable with a basic wire form of antenna. And my first choice of go-to stroke P or stroke holiday antenna is the end-fed half wave. The great thing about the end-fed half wave, if you're not familiar with it, is that if you cut it for your preferred band, so you cut it for 40 meters, then it will also be halfway on 40 meters, but it will also be resonant on every harmonic. It's like a dipole in many senses because it transmits like a dipole. The radiation pattern is similar to a dipole; it's just fed at the end. But whereas a dipole is resonant on every other harmonic, every third harmonic and fifth and so on, the end-fed half wave has the great ability of being resonant on every harmonic. So it'll be resonant on 40, 50, 28 if it's for 40 meters. And if it's on 80 meters with an appropriate matching network, my 80 meter end-fed half waves work on every band from 80 through to 6 with an SWR of considerably less than 1.6 to 1 on every band and across most of the bands. So they can be a very, very versatile antenna. They're easy to deploy either with or without coax. Because they're like a dipole in terms of radiation pattern, maximum radiation is from the center of the length of the radiator. So even though it's fed from the end, if you get the middle up as high as you possibly can, that's of maximum benefit. But you do need to have some sort of a matching network or matching transformer. Typically, not exclusively, but typically that's a 49 to 1 or similar so unbalanced to unbalanced matching transformer. Little disadvantage is it does, if it's a half wave long at your base frequency, it does need length. So, the 40 meter end-fed half wave is going to be 66 feet long or so, and for 80 meters, if you want to cover all the bands through to sort of 6 and so on, that's 132 foot long. That's a long antenna to take on holiday or portable with you, unless space is unlimited. On the right-hand side there, I've just put the radiation patterns of an end-fed half wave, and the same applies for a dipole on other harmonics there, and you'll see that in the top left corner of that picture, typical dipole radiation pattern at the fundamental frequency you cut it for. So if it's 66 feet long, half a wave on 40 meters, you'll get very much a dipole type characteristic. And as you operate at multiple of wavelengths, you find you get some deeper lobes and deeper nulls. They look very dramatic, those deep nulls and lobes, don't they? In practice, can you really hear those or tell that they're present? Well, I'm yet to be convinced. But for my style of operating, what I really want to do is I want to have a nice contact with somebody. I don't care how far away or how close they are. DX is exciting, of course it is, but actually I'm just very happy to have a nice natter on CW with anybody, even if they're just down the road. So I'm not too concerned about the radiation pattern personally. My second antenna of choice is a little bit more practical in some ways, and that's the random in brackets long wire. I won't get into detail here, but you do need to make sure that your random long wire isn't truly random. I know that sounds like a misnomer, but if it's too close to a wavelength or multiple of a wavelength of a band you can operate on, it can lead to some high impedance and some difficulty in operating. So if you just Google what's a good length for a random end-fed long wire, you'll get some lengths which aren't that random, but they're good lengths to operate around, which means you're probably going to be able to match it most effectively. And they're really easy to deploy, again, with or without coax. I'm going to say a little bit more about the coax issue, but very easy to deploy. You can throw up pretty much any length that you can fit in the space you've got available. You can get away with only one support because it's fed at the end, but it does require a tuner, of course. And I'm not one for carrying around separate little tuners, so I'll only take this when I'm taking one of my radios that has a built-in tuner. And again, I'll talk about some of those and some of those kits that I use in a little while. So let's talk about the coax issue. I'm sorry, that should have been that little scribble there was me practicing earlier. Please ignore the scribble. So if you're operating relatively QRP, say 20 watts or less, then actually, I think, why would you bother taking the weight and the bulk of coax if you're using a wire antenna? Because it really isn't particularly necessary. If you do want to use coax, though, then for short runs, 5 or 10 meters at HF frequencies, then RG174 is really thin, really flexible, and the losses are more than acceptable, even with just a few watts at HF. And it takes up so much less space than RG58 or anything else, really. And it's so much lighter and more flexible and easier to get into a small space. If you're using the end-fed half-wave antenna, or indeed the random wire, really, often people talking about having a ground plane or radials or a counterpoise. You can run a counterpoise, and I often do with an end-fed half-wave antenna or with a long wire. But if you're using coax, and I always do, I'm not using coax, but if you are using coax, then actually the coax outer shield can sometimes act as that counterpoise for you, removing the need. If you're taking coax, you perhaps don't need to take a radial or a counterpoise wire. If you do take one, a really good little tip though is to add a crocodile clip to the end of your counterpoise. I always take 5 meters, just a thin hookup wire with me as my counterpoise connected to the coax outer, or the outer of the BNC of the radio if I'm using that. And the handy thing about that is if you're near to some railings or a wire fence or something like that, you can just clip the counterpoise onto that with the little croc clip, and you're significantly improving the counterpoise area that you've got deployed, and that can bring some benefits. So if you are going to terminate without coax, how do you do that? Again, here's a little example from my own kit. On the left hand there, circled in red, is the 49-to-1 homemade balun. Or unun, sorry. So there's a little toroid and a capacitor in there with a specific winding pattern. It's in a bit of PVC water plumbing pipe, and you'll see that there are 2 little blue connectors attached to that. The one on the extreme right-hand end, on the sort of the end of the pipe, is for the radiating wire, and the other one on the side there is for a banana plug for a counterpoise, 5-meter counterpoise. And that's connecting directly there to a little QCX mini transceiver, which is a great little portable rig, about the size of a pack of cards. And so I just connect my counterpoise wire and my radiating wire to that. This will be an end-fed half-wave in this case. And away I go. I've got a resonant antenna for the frequencies that I want to use. On the extreme right of that picture, you can also see what looks like a BNC connector, a little bit of black plastic, and two terminal posts on there. That's another good way of connecting, for example, a random wire to a rig with a tuner or to a tuner. And the black I tend to use as the counterpoise, and the red I will use as the main radiating element. And I'll either just plug in a banana plug, or you can unscrew the terminal post and bite down on the piece of wire that you're using. And here's an example. This is a random wire. And you hopefully can see, if I move the mouse around here, in the red you've got the binding post connected directly to the rig. The red line there goes off to this little homemade wire winder, and that's off to a sloping section of random wire. And the wire off to the bottom left here of the black wire winder is a 5-meter counterpoise. I think in this case connected with a croc clip to a fence, and my faithful dog there just in the top left-hand corner for a bit of company. The good thing about the rig down here in the bottom, the Zygo X5105, it's a great little transceiver, built-in battery, built-in ATU, which will frankly tune anything. And I mean literally anything. I've turned half a kilometre of electric fencing at my place with that, as well as a cowshed roof. You can tune anything with that tuner, really. Doesn't necessarily mean it's an effective antenna, but it can get you on the air. And that's a great little radio for being able to travel light. So, now what about travelling with power? You've got to power this gear somewhere. The Zygo's got a little built-in battery. It'll probably give me about 3 hours worth of operating. That's not going to last me for a week or a fortnight on holiday, though. So you need to give some thought to power. And again, it depends what you're taking, the sort of RF power output you think about putting out, because obviously the greater the RF output power, the greater the demand on your power supply. But you've got a number of options there, haven't you? From the traditional PSU in the top left to a laptop style PSU beneath it. If you're just charging a rig and you're not concerned too much about the RF noise produced by it, then a little 12-volt wall wart charger that you see there next to the main PSU is a good little option, because they're small, they're compact. You can plug your rig into that and charge it, not worrying about RFI, and then when you want to operate, you can plug it and run off the battery. And I've done that a number of times. You've also got up there, a little battery pack, a rechargeable battery pack. The rig itself on the top right there, there's Zygo with a built-in battery. Two interesting ones on the bottom right there. This little device here, this black box in the middle bottom, is I think it's a talent cell recharge, which you can from Amazon. In fact, you can buy empty boxes. You put your own lithium-ion batteries in to create your own power supply. But really intriguingly, I think, on the bottom right is the sort of power bank you would use to charge a mobile phone. And I'm going to talk about that next, because actually, if you're working QRP, that is a really good option, and that's what I took to Sweden with me. So let's just have a little delve into that. So mobile phone power banks, we all think of them as being a 5-volt device, don't we? Well, they are, but equally, if you've got a modern one, they're capable of being so much more. So, welcome to the world of something called PD3, Power Delivery 3. System which allows you to select a different output from your mobile phone or laptop, mobile charging device, your power bank, and you can probably elicit out of that anything between 5 and 20 volts, depending on how you do so, and we'll talk about how we do that in a minute. But that's great, isn't it? 12 and 15 volts are in there, which is a fantastic voltage from which to operate a QRP rig. Most of my QRP rigs are nominally 13.8 volts, but nearly all of them quite happily accept 16 volts or even a little bit more, which is really handy and can squeeze out that little bit of extra power if you're so inclined. But how do you do that? How do you make that work? Well, on this next slide, you'll see my cheap and cheerful power bank from a little supermarket, which cost me just a few quid a year or two ago. And the red cable there on the right is a USB-C cable running from the power bank into a little, well, I call it a dongle, but you'll see it's written there in the middle. It's a ZY12 PDN PD trigger module. I've put that whole mouthful there because actually that's the search phrase you want to type into some of your online shopping sites if you want to buy one of these things. If you put that phrase in, you've got more chance of getting a hit than sort of trying to search anything else. But it's a PD trigger module, and that's the code for it there. And then there's a black USB cable coming out of that, which ends up in I use 2.1 mil coaxial connectors for all of my QRP gear, so it's standardized, and that terminates in that. And what the little triggered module in the middle does is it communicates with the power bank. And in this particular case, it's a little bit fiddly. There's a little push button on there, and there's a multicolored LED. And when you connect the things together, you press that little push button, and the little coloured LED will cycle through 4 or 5 different colours, and each colour represents a voltage. So I know what colour represents either 12 or 15 volts on that module. I'll connect it together, cycle through till I've got the right voltage, connect my rig, and I'm ready to operate. And you might think to yourself at this stage, well, how long is that going to last? Am I going to get much operating out of that? Well, actually, they're quite reasonably chunky, some of these days, and you will find that the current that they can provide is perfectly adequate for QRP levels. And you'll see there that 15 volts, they can provide between 1.8 and 3 amps, and it doesn't list 12 volts there for some reason. I couldn't find a table for 12 volts, but they do almost exclusively deliver 12 volts as well. And so it's going to be somewhere in the same sort of order of current that you can apply. And of course, the larger power bank you get, the more amp hours that's got, the longer it will be able to deliver that sort of current for you. But the beauty of a power bank is if you're going on holiday, you might take one with your phone anyway, and you're going to take a phone charger, I should imagine, and your phone charger can charge your phone, but it can also charge your power bank. So it's a sort of a 2-in-1 process. You can use your power bank for your phone, you can use your phone charger for your power bank, and then you can use your power bank for your operating. And this is what I took with me, and you'll see a little bit more of the kit in a minute when I went cycling up the Swedish coast, because I needed something very small, compact, multi-use, and lightweight. And I could get several hours operating from my little power bank on CW on 40 and 30 meters using that QCX, and only had to charge it every couple of days. So it was really convenient. And of course, as long as you don't go over that 100 watt-hour limit for airlines, or most airlines at least, you can get quite a chunky one, and that could serve you quite well if you're just a casual operator abroad, as I am. So, having shared a few of those sort of considerations and ideas, let's just flick through a few of the holiday kits that I take with me in the hope that it might give you a little bit of inspiration or idea as to how you might put something together that will suit your needs. One of the kits that I take with me, mostly when I go away in the caravan, it has to be said, is the Xiegu G90. That's another good little rig from Xiegu. All of the Xiegu rigs are reviewed on my website, where I reviewed them for practical wireless. In fact, the Xiegu 106, I think, is coming out shortly. In the next month's Radcom, I think you'll be able to read my review of the new Xiegu rig in there. And they're all great for portable operating, and they're at a really keen price point. That's my G90 on a caravan site in Cornwall this year. You'll see there's a little miracle whip antenna connected to that. I would not normally operate with that, but I found it in my bag. So for a little bit of fun, I had an experiment, and it was equally as unimpressive as I remembered. But normally I'd operate with a different antenna, and you'll see how I did that later. But that all fits lovely in this little travel case here. This travel case here used to hold a 10-inch laptop. So it's quite small. You can see my hand down there for scale. You've got the rig in there, a homemade CW key there, microphone, and in a little zip pocket on the reverse side is a random wire antenna counterpoise and the little banana clip terminal post connector you saw that goes onto a BNC connector in the back. And the G90 doesn't have an external or an internal power supply, so you do need power for that. But it does have another very, very good internal ATU. So that's quite good. And that will put out about 20 watts. It's quite heavy. It's reasonably chunky, and obviously it's got a slightly bigger current draw than most of my traditional QRP gear. So that does require some consideration about where you would take it. I wouldn't bother taking it on an airline, for example, although there's no reason why you couldn't. This is the Xiegu G105 I described and showed you earlier. Internal battery, internal ATU, 5 watts, all bands on HF. Quite easy to set up for digital modes as well if you want to. Quite a good little CW rig. It has one or two little advantages as well. If you do want to not carry the microphone with you, then actually it's got as well as an internal speaker here, it's got a tiny little microphone down here and a PTT button on the top. So you can use it like a fairly chunky brick walkie-talkie. So if you want to go onto SSB, you don't need to bother taking a microphone with you. And that fits quite nicely in an old second-hand camera bag. That's what that is. And this setup came with me on a interrail tour around Europe with the wife and family just before COVID. And I think we did 15 or 16 cities in half a dozen or so countries in 3 weeks. And this came around with me everywhere. It's quite compact. It zips up from the back, which was quite light from a secure point of view in terms of moving around cities and carrying it around. And in the bottom here, you can see there's the rig, there's the microphone and key, associated leads. And in here, I've got various bits of antenna equipment. So that's quite a good kit. And that comes with me doing SOTA activations on holiday in the UK from time to time. Then this is the kit I took with me cycling to Sweden. And I was really quite pleased with this. You see the pence on the left-hand side for scale. So it's not very big. I didn't weigh it because I'm not into how many grams does this bit of kit weigh type person. But it is quite light and compact. And I was very comfortable cycling for 400 kilometres with this and my other luggage back in May. You'll see that the box is, well, I wouldn't describe it as waterproof, but it's certainly water-resistant box, which was fairly cheaply available on one of the online resellers with the traditional pick and pluck foam. We've got the power bank here, which I bought from the supermarket. Here, the yellow wire is the counterpoise I described earlier with a banana plug here. Look, and there's a slightly rusty crock clip to connect to any old metal that you might find when you're operating. This is an old Sony receiver antenna from an old Sony receiver I had back in the early 80s, which died, and the wire wasn't quite long enough, so I stripped the wire out and put a length of wire in, which is exactly a half wave on 30 meters, and then I put some heat shrink sleeving on the wire at the 20 meter point. And what I do is I plug that in to the rig, which you'll see in a minute, and I just pull it out to the relevant length. If I'm operating on 20, I stop at the heat shrink sleeve, and if I'm operating on 30, it's fully extended. And there's no degradation in performance that I can tell from having the coil at the end of the the wire, when you're operating on 20, it just seems to act like a blob of wire, and I don't seem to get any issues. Here you'll see the 49-to-1 on the homebrewed one in the bit of PVC pipe, a homebrew CW paddle from the 3D printer, the QCX Mini, which is designed as a 20-meter rig, but operates beautifully on 30 meters too, which is a bit of a bonus. And then here, your traditional sort of Altoids mint tin, which contains, earbuds, a lead for the CW paddle, the little trigger module for the USB power bank we spoke of, and USB cables and things like that. So that became a really quite nice and tidy unit, probably about the size of a paperback book. And I've used that a few times since the cycle trip, actually, when I've been away during the course of this year, and really quite enjoy using that little kit. This is a slightly smaller version that I'd put together as a prototype before I went to Sweden. And this fits into an even smaller box, as you can see, not much bigger than the rig. It's not as well protected or padded, which is why I moved to the other version in the end, but that does all fit in that little pelly case there, really quite snugly. At the bottom here, this is just a little tiny key, so that's just a 3.5mm stereo jack plug, and glued into the end of it is a little momentary press-to-talk switch, or not press-to-talk, but a little momentary switch, on-off switch, and that is a little CW key, which I just plug into the rig if I really want to travel very, very light. So another kit that I quite enjoy using, I've used a few times on holiday in the caravan this year, is the what's known as the True SDX. That's the radio in the bottom right with the yellow knob. These are now available, I think, from an online seller in China. They came out of a project by a German amateur, DL2MAN, and a colleague of his, I can't remember his call sign, a PE1. And they basically took the basis of the QCX rig and then made it a multi-band, multi-mode rig. So it does SSB, CW, will do digital modes with the appropriate sort of computer connected to it. Has a built-in PTT button, built-in microphone, built-in speaker. Not great, I have to say, but they work. And then up here in the Altoids tin, that's a homemade 12-volt lithium-ion battery pack. I haven't tried taking that on the airplane, purely because that is 3 lithium-ion cells out of an old laptop, taped together with a BMS. And if anything's looking a bit dodgy electrically, that might be it. So I probably wouldn't take that with me. A power lead, 5 meters RG174 there, and you can see what I was talking about how thin and flexible that is. In fact, I think that's 10 meters. Here is a end-fed half wave, which is trapped for 40, 30, and 20 meters. This radio will actually do 80 through to 20, but I tend to, when I operate portable, 40, 30, and 20 bands of choice. So it's a 3-band antenna. There's a 49-to-1 on attached to that on the wire winder. And then here we've got a homemade paddle, which is basically a couple of copper pipe clips on a piece of overflow pipe. And some earbuds. And again, in a similar sort of waterproof case, pencil for scale. That's quite rugged, robust, and travels around with me a fair bit. And then here we have one of my early ones. When I first got back into the hobby back about 2017, I came across the U-Bits, and this is a U-Bits version 3. It basically comes as a pre-populated HF transceiver board, PCB, and all you have to do is wire up the connectors. I designed and 3D printed this grey panel you can see here because I wanted a flat panel for the radio to sit under. That will cover, if my memory serves, I don't think it does top band, I think it's 80 through to 10, between 10 and 3 watts out, depending on the band you're on. Inside this, I also put a Raspberry Pi, built a Raspberry Pi 3B, so it will do digital modes from within the box as well, using my phone or a tablet as the screen. And then on the right here, you've got a SOTA Beams end-fed half-wave tuner, antenna wire on a spool, which is basically marked at the half-wave for every frequency you might want to operate on. So you just pull it out to the length that you want. A homebrew lithium-ion battery at the top, mic and key, and power supply, wall-wart power supply there, which is actually quite quiet, and you could run the rig on quite happily. And I use, as I say, the Raspberry Pi on the phone, using a VNC server to be able to visualize what the Pi screen is. And then finally, this is bit of a work in progress. This is a bit of a bigger beast, and for scale, you'll see that that's a 15-inch display from an old laptop there, which I rescued. At the top right, you've got a Raspberry Pi 4 computer, which is pretty powerful, or single board computer. Underneath that, the printed circuit board is a driver. It's a special driver board for allowing you to connect any device to the LCD screen that you've salvaged or from your laptop. They're about 25 to 30 pounds, but it enables you to basically connect anything with either an HDMI, DVI, or what's the other one? the other type of connector, the VGA connector that you can use and use it as a display. Tucked behind here, behind the screen, is a SSD hard drive connected to the Raspberry Pi. There's a little buck converter down here to take 12 volts and convert it to 5 for the Raspberry Pi. And then on the right hand side here, we've got the ammo box power supply. That's a plastic ammo box I bought. I popped in there a 12 volt, 12 amp hour lithium iron phosphate battery, along with a voltage display, on-off switch, and USB ports, which are on the side here. You can't see very clearly, but that's my power supply that I use with the G92. And then here you've got various little boxes for accoutrements and bits and bobs. And on the left-hand side, Bluetooth keyboard, coax, antenna, notebook, and things. In the middle here, you can put any transceiver you like, of course, and I have used this a few times with both the G90 and the X5105. This transceiver you see here actually is an SDR 10-watt HF transceiver, which I'm hoping to sort of build a panel over here, a bit like I did with the U-bits, and bring all the control, not controls, because the controls are through the Raspberry Pi, but bring the antenna connection and things like that, microphone connection to the surface. And that's all in a toolbox from one of your favourite DIY suppliers for about £25, which is very rugged and quite useful for that job. It's a bit of a big, heavy kit. I've taken it with me in the car. I've taken it with me in the caravan. It's a little bit big for the caravan, if I'm honest. So that will get used mainly for sort of carborne expeditions, really. I don't think I'd take it on the plane with me. There's no reason why you couldn't if you checked it in, I guess. But that's, as I say, a bit of a work in progress. And then finally, really, before we just look at a few sort of use case examples, what about leaving the radio at home? You could go HF on holiday and operate remotely. It's becoming more and more possible. There's quite a few modern rigs which allow remote software. I think the IC705 does, for example, and a number of the bigger, more established rigs do. But there's no reason why you can't do that with any rig. And what the image you see on the screen there is an old iPad, which is connected to the receiver that was, the transceiver in the shack, and was connected to the shack computer by means of remote software. So Real VNC is what I used. And effectively, I could take that iPad anywhere in the world, and as long as the rig was switched on back at home in the shack, then I could operate FT8, FT4, any of the digital modes at will. And whilst I've not taken it abroad to do that, because I didn't want to leave the rig switched on at home without me being able to switch it off and on, for example, then I have taken it around about into the local radio club and things. And in fact, nowadays, with all the Wi-Fi connectivity, there's no reason why you couldn't power your rig off and on from anywhere in the world, just using an appropriate sort of Wi-Fi enabled plug, of course. So it really is possible just to take your tablet, your laptop, or even just your phone and operate from HF wherever you might be, or VHF for that matter, wherever you might be in the world, without having to take any HF or radio equipment with you whatsoever. For me personally, not quite so much fun. I like the old antenna setting up and putting the kits together, but it's still very much a viable option. In fact, there was something on a social media site I saw today of a fellow who'd got internet on a transatlantic flight and was operating FT8 via his phone to his rig at home from 38,000 feet. Why not? And so then finally, I'll just finish off with a few pictures of me, actually making use of some of this stuff. So on the left there, I've got the Zygu sat camping somewhere, I think, and you'll see there the little red wire winder in front of my feet is a spool for an end-fed half wave unun, and you've got a counterpoise and the end-fed half wave radiator popping off in front of me. The image on the right is me in Sweden. We were in an Airbnb, and I've got a 40-meter end-fed half wave hoisted up the flagpole of the property there with the permission of the owners of the house. I wasn't very successful. Big solar flare that a couple of days while I was there, but Whisper, which the QCX will also run, proved very useful there. When I wasn't able to have any QSOs, I had some tremendous Whisper spots despite the solar flare. And then on the left there, that's the ammo can, so the power supply with a TX500 from Lab 599 I had on review at a SOTA site. On the right, that was a significant flop. That was me on the train in Germany on this Interrail trip with the X5105 and a little whiz loop that had been lamed by Moonraker for review, trying to operate. I'd failed to take into account the fact that it was a high voltage, high speed train with overhead lines and S20 plus noise in the background. While the conductor was quite interested and we had a nice conversation, that was the only conversation I had on that journey because no contacts were had. And then here on the left-hand side, on holiday with the caravan at the early part of this year in Cornwall, there's a slight departure from my normal holiday antennas on the left there. I don't know if you can follow the mouse up, but from the tow bar mount, there's an MFJ 1979. Actually, it might be a clone of the MFJ 1979. It's a 17-foot telescopic whip, which packs down not much bigger than that. It's quite reasonably robust. You wouldn't want to drive with it, of course, but it gives you a full quarter wave at 20 meters. And if you want to go to the other bands and not use an ATU, you can just telescope it down a bit to get the right SWR for any of the other higher bands. And you might just see from the tow bar there are 3 or 4 very thin yellow 5-meter long radials just streaming out there. And at the front of the caravan on the table there is the G90 you saw earlier on. So later holiday near Falmouth in August this year with the caravan, and there's a 6-meter pole there that's stuck in the trees with an end-fed half wave. And I think I was using the True SDX kit that holiday. I had some very nice QSOs all around Europe. And then this is again from the Interrail trip. This is going back to what I said about choose your mode wisely, especially if you're traveling to cities. This is the rooftop terrace of a hotel in Paris. And that's my young son. He's now M7JOT, but he wasn't licensed then. And we're sat on this terrace. It's nice and quiet. I string up this antenna amongst the sort of the trees and the foliage there, and start to have a listen around. And if you zoom in on that picture, as I did as I was preparing this presentation, you can see S9 plus 10 of noise and no contacts to be had. And perhaps FT8 might have been a better choice there, but I didn't go with that equipment. So that essentially is it from me. You can find a fair bit of information about some of these holiday travels and some of the kits I use and put together on my website, which is listed there, along with a number of the magazine articles that I've been lucky enough to have published. And essentially, that is me. So thank you for listening, and I'll pass it back to David in case there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daimon. You know what? If it wasn't quite so cold now, it seems to have ended quickly. I think that would have persuaded me to go out in the next couple of weekends or something and do stuff. Really good inspirational stuff. Thank you so far, Daimon. Now, if you've got any questions or comments for Daimon, or maybe some of your experiences with similar things, then this is the time to put them onto either YouTube chat or onto BATC, and we'll read them back to Daimon as well. We've already got a couple of comments on that. And please don't forget to include your first name and your call sign as well if you've got one. So Daimon, we'll start with a few, firstly, lots of lovely warm comments. In fact, I'll start with the last comment that came in actually, which was from Terry2E0IPK. It says, Interrail, I must ask you about it sometime. So there we are. You've given someone a thought about working from trains. One of the first questions I want to read you about is where is it? Terry 2E0IPK. He says, I'll be at Friedrichshafen next June, but being only an intermediate, I can't use radio in Germany. So I'll just have to look at the gear there, although he's getting used to leaving his gear at home. What do you do, say about that sort of thing? Because obviously a lot of people watching this are not going to be full licenses. Are there any countries, do you know offhand, where you can go without having to operate? You said one of your sons, I think, was an M7. So working abroad without a full license?
Yeah, I think, as I alluded to earlier, I know that some countries do allow it, or seem to allow it, although I've not tested it. Australia is one of them. So, so if he fancies nipping to Australia instead of Friedrichshafen, then I think he'd be okay. I mean, the RSGB, I think an Ofcom's position has always been that not having that reciprocal arrangement to be able to use an intermediate or foundation license abroad, particularly in a CEPT country, is supposed to be an inducement to encourage you to study for, you know, your intermediate and your full license in due course. And I guess I get that. But the other thing, of course, that he could do is operate abroad anyway, without breaking any licensing restrictions, and that is to operate remotely in the way that I've described. I think there's a couple of articles on my website from something I published in PW a couple of years ago about how to go about that. So, you know, why not take your tablet, your phone, your iPad, leave things set up at home in a way that perhaps somebody can switch them off in an emergency or something, perhaps. But, you know, be able to, if FT8 or BSP K31 or something like that is your mode, to do that. And of course, the other thing that's available these days, or I'm not a user myself, things like hotspots, things like Zello, internet-enabled radio, which will allow you to operate. In fact, actually, that's just prompted a thought. When I think the very first time I went abroad on holiday, having got back into the radio before the Italy trip, was to Greece. And I hadn't really got any gear I could take to Greece with me, other than a big HF rig, and I wasn't taking that. And I think I downloaded something like Zello or something like that and had a few QSOs from the terrace of my room at the hotel in Greece, with people all around the world. No license at all required, of course, but you're talking to like-minded people. So there are options, and I'd encourage him to consider that. And of course, you know, potentially study for the full license too.
Yeah, as you say, it's actually a really good reason to study for the full license, but a good idea to be able to work portable as well abroad, even if you haven't got a full license. Nick H has said that he recommends a MyAD LFP 8AH, which is a great 12 volt QRP power supply, he says. I guess that's being 8AH, that's probably 8 amp hours, some kind of battery. I don't know if you've heard that one.
No, I'm not. What's the first name? MyAD, did you say?
MyAD, yes. MIADY.
Oh,
MyAD,
yeah,
possibly, yeah.
Yeah, I think I've heard of the brand, but no, I've not heard of them. I mean, I think anything that if that's 12 volt, 8 amp hour, so you're going to be 96 watt hours, aren't you? 12 times 8, so that would be the airline luggage limit for most airlines. There are lots of choices, and you know, in a short while, and because I write the Amateur Radio on a Budget series in Practical Wireless, and in the next edition of that, coming up in a month or two's time, I'm going to be talking about how you can harvest batteries out of old laptops, 18650 lithium-ion batteries, and make your own power supplies. And so there are many options in terms of batteries. And of course, if you are taking batteries with you, then you can use that sort of wall wart idea to charge them, which is light, compact, and you don't need to worry about the RFI.
Yes, and I must admit, I love the idea, and I've made a note of it myself, the ZY12 PDN trigger module. That sounds like a fascinating small bit of electronics that you can carry to you know, make very versatile use of your charger.
Yeah, they're about £5 or £6, I think, on most of these sort of online shopping sites and auction sites. What you do need to do is when you order it, is save the page of the site that you ordered it from, because they invariably come without instructions, and often they're different. And if you've got reference back or bookmark the page where you bought it from, often the instructions are on the photograph descriptions of the article, and that's the place to go back to work it out. But no, they're remarkable little devices. I've got a couple, and I'm really quite frankly amazed at just how long a little power bank like that, and mine's not very big, might even be in the drawer next to me, just for scale. Look, that's the size of it, and I can get 3 or 4 hours out of that with my QCX operating quite hard. At 5 watts.
Amazing. I guess that little trigger module is a sort of DC to DC converter type thing, which has got variable voltage.
No, it's not. No.
Right.
No, what it does is it communicates using this PD format with the power bank, and the power bank has the ability to amend its voltage. So
Right.
the module isn't changing anything. All it's doing is communicating with the power bank and saying, "I'd like you to give me this voltage, please," as opposed to the voltage that you might give me as a default.
So you've got to make sure that the power bank is PD compatible to be able to do
Yes.
that. Right.
It
Okay.
was
Thank you.
PD2, now PD3.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. Terry 2E0 IPK says, I use a small phone power bank to drive my Zumspot when out portable. Otherwise, a 12-volt lead acid battery when doing HF, and I use a buddy stick antenna.
Yeah, that's quite a common sort of setup, isn't it? And I think the Zumspot type idea, or the Pi-Star node, as I have, although I don't use it very much now, really quite lends themselves to be driven from your cigarette lighter of your radio or from a PD power bank, so that you can access, DMR, Yaesu System Fusion, D-Star, those proprietary digital modes. And really, when you're operating something like the Zumspot or the Pi-Star node, they're designed to run from 5 volts by default. That's their sort of natural sort of power requirement. And so it's really, really easy to find, these days, everything's being charged or delivered with 5 volts or around there, isn't it? So it's really easy to find in your junk box something that will do that job.
Yeah.
Only the other day, having replaced the internet here and replaced the mesh network, I got rid of a lot of my Wi-Fi repeaters, which I'd replaced, and every single one of them had got a 12-volt wall wart. And I must have now the world's largest collection, but they're really nicely RF quiet, those ones. So that, those sorts of things are often around us, and if you find a good one, they're worth keeping.
Absolutely. ADG6AD says, firstly, great pro tips. And he goes on to ask a question. What pole and supports, if any, have you taken with you for the wire antennas?
Well, sometimes I don't take anything. If I know roughly where I'm going, and I know there's going to be a tree or something available, I'll basically just toss it over the tree. I'll often take 5 or 10 meters of thin cord with me to do that, and perhaps tie it to a water bottle or a stone or something, and lob it over. But I tend to have used a variety of fishing poles. I mean, I've used all sorts of cheap and cheerful ones. I used to take a 10-meter pole with me to a lot of places. The trouble is with a 10-meter pole, which I bought for about £40 off one of the shopping sites, is they are typically quite long to start with, even when they're compact. And I ended up with my preferred one now, shameless advertising, I'm afraid, is the Sota Beams 6-meter pole, which is really compact and actually will fit along the length of the crossbar of my bike if I want it to, and sit nicely underneath there without getting in the way. So it's really compact, pops up 6 meters. I don't worry too much about height when I'm operating portable. Of course, the higher the better, but if you're going to do that, you're going to have to take bigger and more equipment. And I'm not there to work massive DX. I'm just there to have a good time and to make some contacts. So I've operated then fed half waves as little as 2.5, 3 meters off the ground and had plenty of contacts. But any fishing pole will do. Just think about the size when it's compacted rather than the size it's extended. I find that's more the limiting factor, to be honest.
Sounds good. Good evening from SM7 UDB, Mikael, Sweden, I guess. And he goes on to say, trains are a very good Faraday cage as well. So I would think it would be very hard to get good contacts. But thank you for a very nice talk.
Thank you. I think, has he put his name on that email?
Mikael.
Mikael,
yeah. Mikael. I hope I've pronounced that correctly.
I'm not sure, but that might be the gentleman of the CWQSA with the other night. Yes, they are, aren't they? It was a bit of fun. I'd done a lot of time spent on the train at a Faraday cage. I'd never used a little loop before. In fact, some people, when I published that article in Practical Wireless, very helpfully pointed out to me that I'd probably got the loop orientated incorrectly too, because actually I'd got the loop broadside to the train window, and actually most radiation is in the plane of the loop. And so really, if I'd have turned it around 90 degrees, that may have been more effective. But frankly, Faraday cage or not, the RFI from those overhead lines, it was never going to happen.
Okay. Over on BATC, GFON8NT, he's put several links there. So if you're on BATC, you'll be able to see those. They are for the recommendation of 1985 on Sept Radio, and basically I think that is probably linked to a document. I haven't had time to look at it yet, but probably a link to the document of the sort of exchange arrangements and where you can go to do which bands or whatever. But obviously you can check your own license in your own country as well. So thank you very much for putting that on, Jeff. Matthew Smith, who's M0VWS, he says, hello Damon, great talk, thank you. The Go Box is excellent. But a question, when taking batteries on the plane, are there any restrictions on the battery chemistry, or is it just the watt-hour rating?
From what I can determine, it just seems to be the watt-hour rating. I've not, and I did check. I mean, I've got my own experience in terms of what I've travelled with. I also did some research, of course, to try and make sure I was saying the right thing tonight, and that my own experience wasn't unique. But everything I can seem to find, both in experience and research, seems to show me the battery chemistry doesn't feature. It's about the watt hours. I say there are some airlines that will allow you to take two separate batteries of 100 watt hours, which will give you a little bit extra capacity, of course.
Yes, actually, I've just seen a comment that he's added a bit later that says Li LifePo. I don't know how you pronounce that now. I know there's LiPos and things like that, but LifePo 004 basically times 4 in series is 13.2 volts, which is better than Lion Lion times 3, which will give you 11.3. So I guess the point he's making is you're getting closer to that magic 13.8 volts, which is what a lot of equipment wants.
Well, yeah, but nearly every piece of equipment you'll read that says it'll take 13.8 volts, particularly QRP, which is, you know, my thing really, will have a plus or minus of at least 10% in the specifications of it. So, you know, 13.8, 10%, 1.4 volts nearly, isn't it? So, you know, 12 volts is not really an issue. In fact, most of my rigs will operate down to 9 volts, and most of them will safely operate up to 16 and a half. If you put 3 lithium-ion batteries, 18650 cells in series, then you know, actually when they're fully charged, they'll give you about 16.8 volts. Yeah, 4.2 volts each. And I've not had a radio yet that's caused a problem. If you're concerned about that sort of thing and you think you're at the upper end, the simple trick is just to pop a diode or two in series with the positive line, because a diode will drop about 0.7 of a volt. So a little signal diode, a 1M4, 148 or something like that, in line with a 16 volt battery should give you 15.3, for example. But always obviously check your specifications of the rig that they're supplied by the manufacturer. My own experience has been that those plus or minus 10% tolerances are quite not generous. What's the word I'm looking for? The opposite, really.
Opposite, yeah. Tolerant, probably, aren't they? Yeah, I think the more modern radios, and my personal experience from this is I had a lovely radio which I loved called the IC7000, which is an ICOM, a very compact all-band radio, but it was really sensitive, and if you ran it to anything under 12 volts, it wouldn't work, and it obviously wanted the 13 or so volts that you normally get from car batteries. So, but that was quite some years ago, probably at least 10-year-old technology now. Modern radios, they tend to have DC to DC converters, and as you say, if you're worried about it being on the top end, you can always put a diode in. If it's a bit more than a small QRP rig, then maybe you can use a rectifier diode, which will just give you that, you know, rated at 1 or 2 amps or something if it's something a bit bigger. But great advice. I got a lovely comment. I must read you from here. He means it, I'm sure, in a really friendly way. I don't know if it's a he or she, actually. There isn't a name on this, unfortunately, but it's from MM7WAB, and he calls you an amateur radio womble, which I think is lovely.
Which one? Uncle Bulgaria?
Well, I'll let you decide, or your children decide on that, maybe. He says also you can always use network assisted modes, such as Freestar Network. I use this every day to QSO with friends around the world, he says.
Yes, they're not things I'm particularly familiar with. I had a little dabble with Yaesu System Fusion and things, but they didn't hold my interest personally for very long. But there are so many, these things are growing exponentially, I think, actually. And unless you're really into them, it's quite difficult to keep abreast. But no, I think that's good advice. I think there's plenty of opportunity for you to use radio in a way which is, you know, different to the way we've been used to, really, and will allow you, if you are a foundation or an intermediate license, to find your way onto the air, even if you are abroad, without contravening any licensing restrictions. I just want to pop back, if you don't mind, Dave, just quickly to the previous question about the power, because it's just sparked a thought in my mind. The little True SDX radio I showed you, which I bought as part of a UK group buy before you could buy them commercially, that will operate actually at 5 volts too, just from a USB lead, but it will just give 500 milliwatts. And I have had dozens of European-wide QSOs with just 500 milliwatts from that rig. So, you don't even need to worry about getting up to 12 volts with some equipment.
No, that's lovely to run on 5 volts. And half a watt, as you say, I mean, I've got friends in our local radio club here in Norfolk, and, they love working QRP. It's their challenge. 5 watts to them is high power, so half a watt they would love. And I saw the Altoids tin as well in one of your homemade rigs as well, and there's quite a lot of those around our club as well where people have built stuff. I must say, I'm sure on behalf of many of the people watching this as well, it's nice to see a true home constructor as well. They're not just bought bits of kit. You clearly make quite a lot yourself, and looking in fact at the bench on your right there, you've got something on the bench there that you're making as well, so that's good to see.
Well, actually, I only got back into that recently. To my shame, when I was first licensed back in 1982, I was about 14. And I used to subscribe to Sprat from the GQRP club. And I used to look at things like the OXO rig and lots of other rigs. I never really had the confidence to build them at that age. And it was only getting back into radio 6 or 7 years ago that I sort of, I can do this. I'm a man, I'm a grown-up.
No, it's great, and construction is I think one of those bits of the hobby, possibly, dare I say, because equipment has got generally cheaper, relatively, and so maybe there's less reason to have to do it, whereas if you talk to people who did this a long time ago, 50, 60 years ago, there was no other way than build your own equipment from surplus electronics. So I think that's one of the things, but it's lovely to see people making stuff, because you can have a lot of fun, as you say, things like the QRP Club, which is just a few pounds a year to join. You can get a lot of interesting circuits and things to go from that. But anyway, I guess the talk isn't really all about that. I just wanted to add that it was nice to see all that home-built equipment there. Actually, I've got the name of Paul as well. The name of MM7WAB. Actually, he calls himself an amateur radio womble. It's part of his long name on the YouTube there. You'll be able to look at these later on. He's Hairy Paul from Ayrshire in Scotland, apparently. He says, is it worth the bother of trying to use solar panels to augment power for portable operation? Have you tried this, and did you get reasonable results?
So I haven't tried it particularly myself. There is, what's his call sign? There is an amateur on YouTube, a gentleman up in the Nordic countries. I really can't remember his name now. He calls himself, no, I can't remember. If I find it, I'll let you know, David, and perhaps you can post it. But if you search on YouTube for sort of radio prepping and stuff, there is a guy up in the Nordic states. He's done masses, and he regularly camps out with solar panels, homemade batteries, testing radios for longevity. I've never done it personally. I don't really operate when I go on holiday for that long at a time. So for me, it would just be cumbersome, and I find another way of doing it, really. There's no reason why you can't, and I know a number of people do so successfully. But of course, you're just going to choose wisely, because you've got to make sure that you're going to put more in than you take out in terms of that sort of power chain, haven't you? To make sure you don't run out, and it's worth taking the panel with you, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, he comes back with one other comment as well. He says, have you used STL's mag loops or spiral loops at portable? I'm experimenting with spiral loops and surprised how well they work considering their diminutive size.
No, I haven't. I do have an old aluminium bicycle wheel I picked up in the garage of the day, which is going to be my first ever mag loop project. I don't know if I wouldn't describe myself as a cynic. I'd like to think of myself as perhaps healthily cynical. So I can't get out of my head that a full-size antenna is probably always going to be better. But I do know some people who've had some remarkable results with mag loops, and of course they do operate in a slightly different way, don't they? So I have a plan, and perhaps I'll publish something about that when I get around to doing it. But I know people have quite a bit of success. I think the coax ones seem to be probably quite appealing because they use quite stiff coax, but you can take them down and spiral them up into a slightly more compact size, can't you? I don't really want to be taking a 27-inch bicycle wheel with me on the plane, but I mean, why not? I've taken a bike.
Yeah, well, absolutely. You'll be like, one of the lovely things about doing something that is live is when people interact. And you mentioned that you couldn't remember the name of the person who talked about solar panels, and we've literally had 7 or 8 people. I don't mention everybody there, both on BATC. We've got Jeff saying that, and we've also got Andy and Graham and Matthew and Peter all saying Julian OH8STN. is the one.
That's the one. That's the one. Yes.
So I guess.
And I remember watching a lot of his videos in the early days. I don't watch them quite so much now because it doesn't really suit my style of operating. But I was really fascinated with his channel in the early days when he was building his own batteries and battery banks as well. And yeah, that's definitely the go-to site if you're thinking of operating portable solar, I think.
And one of my, I must just mention as well, we were going back to the sort of where you can get the regulations for SEPT and things like that. One of my RSGB colleagues, Steve, M1ACB, has actually said that we've got a page on the RSGB website about operating abroad with links to the SEPT docs and societies. I won't read the link out because most of you, I think, are watching on YouTube, and you can click on the link that Steve has put up there. So if you're interested in finding out exactly what you can do with SEPT, and with all the SEPT regulations and everything, have a look at that link on there. He said, and well, Paul's come back again, our amateur radio Womble friend, and said, I've found spiral loop gives wider bandwidth than traditional mag loop STL. All good fun. Have a go and see what you discover. So there we are. That's a good motto for the whole of the hobby, isn't it? We've got another, ADG6AD has said a big thumbs up for the Zygu X5105. He's worked Europe on SSB with a 2E0 ERO magnetic loop inside his shack. Yeah,
in fact, you know, there's a lot of love-hate relationships going on with Chinese rigs. Usually, in my experience, from people who've never used one. They're not perfect, but they're at a price point, and usually when they've got the firmware sorted, they deliver pretty well. No, that's great. I know I talk reasonably regularly with a guy called Tony in Italy on SSB when I use SSB, and he has an X5105, and he has a little telescopic antenna about 1.2 meters long. He uses the internal ATU of the Zygu to tune it, no counterpoise. Just his body capacitively, I suppose, and he sits in his kitchen and works all around Europe on his 5 watts. Conditions have got to be right, of course, but it can be done. And who knows? You know, we're approaching hopefully the top of a new sunspot cycle. And I remember the one in the mid 80s, and crikey, you could work on a piece of length of wet spaghetti. So hopefully we'll get back to that and have a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Well, it is good. You've been truly inspiring tonight, I'm sure. All these people here and others will go to watch this. Hundreds of people will watch this in the next coming days as well, the recording of this. So thank you ever so much for tonight's talk. I mean, I just wrote down a couple of notes as well, by the way. A little tip about taking any equipment abroad, that if it's not regular everyday equipment, what I was told when I used to do it for a living and have to take equipment that could look slightly unusual is I was given a good advice for somebody who travelled a lot to take a brochure with you, or something like a Radcom where you've got adverts which shows the equipment, and then if there is any bit of doubt when someone sees a bit of equipment, doesn't know what it is at an airport or in customs or something like that, then of course you can show them that. That's just a bit of advice I picked up, and it was always good, and I always carried a brochure with the equipment that I was taking at the time.
That sounds like a good tip. I mean, I could say when I went to Sweden, you know, I was really quite nervous about this for a while, because I actually took with me about 15 meters of 2-meter cord and zip ties, you know, in my radio travel kit. And I think they're going to think I'm going to tie up the hostess or something, you know.
Yes, well, yeah, no, I remember. It was a product. My company made a product actually, which and had a red and a green button on it and a red and a green LED, and that was it. And it was a prototype, and I took it, and
not press.
So this is why I actually made a brochure for it to take with me, because and it did really help sometimes in immigration and things like that. So hope that's helped some of you. I love particularly as well the BNC to 4mm adapter. As an electronics engineer, I often use one of those, plug it into an oscilloscope, easy way to connect something in. But I'd never thought of using it for antenna. So another great tip that you've given us tonight. It's been wonderful. And I think I'd like to finish by offering you back the same comment that you gave, where you said that this is a holiday and not a DXPedition, which I think really means it can be fun, take what you can and get the most from it for your hobby. And you've been truly inspirational for everybody watching tonight.
Lovely. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Nice to talk to everybody, and I hope everybody has fun. I look forward to hearing how they get on when they go abroad.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Daimon.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. And there we are. That concludes this webinar. And thanks once again to our guest presenter, Daimon Tilley, G4USI. Thanks also to Studio Director Tammy Palmer, M0TC, and the RSGB team who helped put this series together behind the scenes. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this Tonight to Date, and if you'd like to see details of this and future webinars or recordings of past editions, please visit rsgb.org/webinars, where you can also send us comments and feedback. And just to remind you that the RSGB's first hybrid convention is coming up this weekend. With over 50 lectures and a number of forums, there will be something for everyone to enjoy. The deadline for booking accommodation has now passed, but you can still buy day tickets on the door. Some of the lectures will be live streamed, so you can join in even if you're unable to attend the event in person. For full details, see the RSGB website here at rsgb.org/convention. And finally, a tip that if you subscribe to the RSGB's YouTube channel, you'll be notified of all upcoming Tonight to Date webinars, as well as other new videos and presentations from the Society on a wide range of amateur radio topics. But until next time, this is David G7URP signing off and clear. Bye-bye.